Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by Techstrong and Fairwinds. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning, and we have an exciting panel for you today. First, I do have just a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. Today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion, or you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session today. If you have any questions, we want you to send those in to us using the Q&A tab, which you'll find on the right side of your screen. That's also where you're going to find the chat tab, where we want you to get to know your fellow audience members and maybe let us know from where you're joining. And on the right side of the screen, you'll see a polls section. So if you happen to come in late, or we're going to be launching some polls throughout today's program. So if you miss one, you can make it up right there. And finally, before we close, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So make sure to stick around for the duration of today's program. So our topic is mistakes you are probably making in Kubernetes. And I'm joined by Grace Goody, Engineering Manager at Fairwinds, and Rachel Sweeney, Insights Enablement Engineer at Fairwinds. Rachel, Grace, thank you both so much for joining me. You want to take it away from here?
Yeah, thank you, Cody. Hello, everyone. I see some people from Colombia, Los Angeles, Poland, and Silicon Valley. So we're here today to talk about a number of different mistakes that you're probably making in Kubernetes. These are mistakes that we see come up frequently. And before we get started, my name is Rachel Sweeney. I'm the tech lead for Insights Enablement and all of that good stuff. I'm joined by Grace.
Hi, everyone. I'm Grace Goody, and I'm an engineering manager at Fairwinds.
And so, it's a little bit about us. You probably didn't join just to see us. So let's get on to the good stuff, shall we?
Let's do it.
Fairwinds. Who are we? What do we do? So Fairwinds is the trusted partner for Kubernetes security, policy, and governance. With Fairwinds, we help customers ship cloud-native applications faster, more cost-effectively, and with less risk. So we provide a unified view between Dev, Sec, and Ops by removing friction between those teams with software that simplifies complexity. To add to this, part of Fairwinds, we do a lot of professional services. We manage clusters for clients. We have a lot of SREs that work in our different clients' clusters and just help them do whatever it is they're trying to do in Kubernetes. And then we also have a platform, Insights, which helps solve a lot of Kubernetes issues through software. So helping you out with configuration best practices, how to get, security controls and misconfigurations identified, figuring out where you can save money, and a whole bunch of other stuff like that. So we've got a lot of experience working with all different kinds of people in the tech space and seeing these problems come up over and over again, and then, figuring out solutions to them. And with that, we've got a lot of good information that we're excited to share today. So moving on.
I think it's a great idea to start with a quick polling question, just to learn a little bit about where everyone is in their Kubernetes journey. Are you just starting to learn about containers in Kubernetes? Are you planning to use it in 6 to 12 months? Are you using it in a testing or development environment? Or are you already using it in production? Let us know.
All right. Are you able to see the results at all, Grace?
I do not see them yet. There we go.
Thank you. Imagine awesome. That was Cody. So thank you, Cody.
Thanks, Cody. Looks like most of us are just learning about containers in Kubernetes, and some of us are using it in production as well. So thank you all for joining us today to learn more about some common mistakes that we see, like Rachel said, people make from across the board in the maturity model, whether people are just starting out or have some experience. These are all kind of common mistakes that we see on a lot of different levels of knowledge of Kubernetes. So we're excited to share that with you.
All right, so let's see.
Yeah, so I think we have about 5 common mistakes that we want to talk about today. One of those is granting access to the host node. Another is assuming operations is aligned with security. There's a lot of common issues that happen along the security lines. Running containers with known vulnerabilities is another one. Again, with security, expecting that security will be set by default using native controls, as well as moving to production before you're ready.
Thank you, Grace. Let's jump into them.
Let's do it.
So the first one is granting access to the host node. Unfortunately, this can increase a lot of risk in your cluster, especially if things become compromised. And one thing to keep in mind is that there's a lot of different things that we need to toggle or flags that we need to set within our YAML files to make sure that we're not giving access to that underlying host node. So whenever we deploy something to the cluster, there's a lot of different things we can set, such as, do we want this deployment, this daemon set, this stateful set, this cron job, whatever it might be, is it going to run as privileged? Have we set things like host PID to be available? Or what about access to host path to access the underlying file system? Or what about host network or host IPC? All of these are different things that you can toggle on or off in your containers or in your pods. And when you do that, it's essentially removing some of the isolation that you get with containers running in your cluster. And with each one of those that you turn off or on, you might be exposing more information to the container. And so if that container gets compromised, there's a lot more that the attacker can do. A great example is just simply running as privileged. If you're running as privileged, it's not too difficult to be able to break out of that container and get into the underlying node. And if you have access to the underlying node, then you can suddenly see all of the other containers running on that node. So maybe you just have a front end service and you haven't updated it in 6 months or a year, and there's some vulnerability. Somebody manages to get access into that container, that front end service. It's running as privileged, and now suddenly they can escalate their privileges, get access to the underlying node, and now they can see anything else on that node. So it could be backend services, it could be anything you have that just randomly gets scheduled to that node. And at that point, suddenly there's a lot more ways that attacker can try and figure out how to pivot or move laterally or, get more privilege escalation. Another thing is if you're running on AWS, for example, there could be some cloud credentials that you have access to. And now not only are you trying to, get more exposure into the cluster, now you can potentially get some access to the cloud account that cluster might be running in. So those are some very important things to pay attention to, since it seems like an innocent flag that's not doing much, but it certainly opens up some doors for attackers. Anything you want to add to that, Grace, before we move on?
I think you covered it, Rachel. I think access permissions are super important, and if configured correctly, they can really help out. So thank you for sharing all of that. And participant 779, that's awesome. You're using Kubernetes in production. And if you ever succeed in teaching people that they're not mini VMs, definitely let us know, because I'd love to understand how to do that too. So another issue we see a lot is that teams will assume operations is aligned with security. And sorry, my little guard dog is barking back there if you can hear her. But one of the most important things to think about when setting up your Kubernetes deployment is, of course, security. While Kubernetes offers security features and settings that can help protect your data, security is not built in out of the box. Operators really need to configure these controls to ensure the containers and code running on the cluster are safe. So it's essential that the security team is involved early on in the development process. All too often, we have observed that dev teams will assume that operations is aligned with security, but that's not always the case. Many businesses even view security as an inhibitor because dev teams are encouraged to deliver code fast. If the ops team is empowered to deploy automated security in a DevOps fashion, developers won't have to slow down to run manual security checks. Kubernetes offers many options for configuration, but if your ops team isn't aligned with security, most likely your Kubernetes deployment won't be secure. By default, all applications within a single Kubernetes cluster do have access to everything else within it, but this level of access isn't always necessary, and it can present considerable security risk if your account is compromised. While adopting DevOps helps align development and operations teams, it's essential to bring in security to evaluate potential risks and consider security controls. Best practices are evolving rapidly in Kubernetes, and more recent versions of Kubernetes have resolved some of the security problems that were found in earlier versions. But it is still very important that the security team be involved from the beginning of your Kubernetes deployment, because security should start in the design phase. Choosing a secure architecture and base container image is super important. And to identify and to remediate Kubernetes security risk, you need consistent configuration across clusters. You need container runtime monitoring and scanning. And as tools that are tightly integrated into the CI/CD process are super important too, including ticketing and assignment workflows for remediation. We always encourage people to look for a container and Kubernetes security platform that incorporates DevOps best practices and internal controls as part of its configuration checks. This helps ensure critical alignment between teams, and that creates a DevSecOps environment.
All right, so running containers with known vulnerabilities. This is another one of those things that is pretty much inevitable because there are new CVEs coming out all of the time. And this is another thing where it can cause issues, because we looked at that first issue about giving access to the underlying host. And with CVEs constantly coming out, it's really a game of whack-a-mole, where we're just constantly trying to remediate all of these CVEs as fast as possible. And so there's a lot of different ways to do this. Grace talked about shifting things left and putting them into our CI process. And that's a great step that we can take to make this a lot less painful. There are a lot of great tools out there that will do container image scanning. And there's also a lot of data that show once a vulnerability gets into a cluster, it's a lot more expensive and time consuming to remediate it. And so we want to make sure that the images that we're putting into our cluster on day one are as clean and free from vulnerabilities as possible. And if we don't have image scanning baked into that CI process, it's going to make it a lot harder. So this is one of those things where, we're always trying to reduce our attack surface. And by fixing vulnerabilities and knowing about them as quick as possible and doing something about them, this is a situation where we're going to be able to help with that. Being able to deploy safely and frequently will also make it a lot easier to remediate these vulnerabilities. So it won't be as big of a deal when something pops up on a Wednesday, and hopefully we could have it patched in a day or two. And so, yeah, that's another thing to pay attention to, and try and bake that as early in your pipeline as possible.
For sure. Thank you, Rachel. Another issue we see is that some people will expect security by default using native controls. And we spoke a little bit earlier about the fact that Kubernetes does offer this native security features, but it's a complex platform that consists of multiple components. And since Kubernetes was designed to enable workload migration and overall flexibility, it can be customized to fit many different deployment scenarios. For all its flexibility, Kubernetes is also quite predictable. Kubernetes clusters typically listen on a range of defined ports, which makes it easier for cyber criminals to identify and attack those clusters. By default, all applications within a single Kubernetes cluster have permission to access the entire network within that cluster. If you don't spend time crafting a well-defined RBAC policy or role-based access control, you might find your cluster doing a range of things, such as deleting resources, exposing secrets, even mining Bitcoin without your consent. Kubernetes does not offer security by default, so plan to build a strong security profile from the very beginning of your deployment. So again, get that security team in from the very beginning. Handling configurations properly can be really confusing, but it's important to set access permissions for your clusters according to the principle of least privilege. If an application only needs to view logs, for example, you should limit its access so that it can only view logs. Setting network policy allows you to control communications between different parts of a cluster, which can help you to restrict an attacker to one workload rather than allowing them access to an entire cluster. Network policy can also manage cluster ingress and egress to manage internal and external traffic appropriately and limit the potential attack surface of your apps. Similarly, RBAC can help you grant fine-grained permissions to access different resources on the cluster, also according to the principle of least privilege. While it is always tempting to give admin level access to simple applications just because that would be the easiest way to deploy a new application or to provision a new user, thoughtful Kubernetes RBAC rules reduce the potential damage if an account is compromised, and we find that to be very, very helpful. Together, network policy and RBAC can help you implement effective security policies and controls, and that will greatly improve your Kubernetes security posture.
All right, and the fifth and last for now is moving to production before you're ready. So as it says right there, Kubernetes is complex and there's a lot of different levers that we can pull to make it behave in different ways. There's the API server, there's a scheduler, all the different controllers, there's the kubelet, etcd, the key value store. And, with all these different pieces, how we set up our deployments and all those other resources affect how it is going to be prioritized in the cluster. And so some of the first thing that comes to mind are you aware of how resource requests and limits are affecting how your workload behaves in the cluster? Things like quality of service. If a node starts to run out of resources, the kubelet is going to start looking for resources to remove to free up space. And one of the first things it's going to do is start evicting the lowest priority workloads on there. And, the lowest priority workloads are those that don't have resource requests and limits. So maybe you have this critical thing deployed to your Kubernetes cluster that you do not want to go down, or at least have minimal downtime as possible, but it's getting evicted from a node just because you forgot to set resource requests and limits, and it's got a low quality of service. Other things are like priority class, pod topology constraints. There's a lot of different things that you can set to affect that behavior of making sure that things remain reliable when, things go down, because eventually everything is going to go down. We're not going to have 100% uptime as much as we would like it, and then another issue with this is, do we have good observability into the system? Might have migrated things into Kubernetes. Now we've got them in production. And suddenly once, real user load starts to get into the system and things start behaving differently than we expect, do we have good observability to be able to figure out what's going on quickly without having to get in there and, take a deep dive, which could take a bit of time? So those are some of the main things that we've seen, and we've got some other information to share here as well. Let's see.
We have one more polling question coming up as well.
Yeah.
Maybe do a demo?
Yeah.
Tell it up to it.
Yes. Why don't we do the demo? We do have some stock slides, so I think I'll just skip through that and do a live demo instead.
That'd be great.
And with that, since we're going to skip over those.
Yeah, here's our other polling question. We'd love to learn more about what your greatest opportunity to improve your Kubernetes environment might be. Are you looking for help with the basics? Are you interested in general best practices? Would you like to improve the security posture of your clusters? Is your main concern saving money? Or is it improving the reliability of apps running in Kubernetes? Let us know. And Rachel, I appreciate you giving us a live demo. I hate to put you on the spot like that, but you're such a pro. I think it would be great if you don't mind.
Of course. Yeah, happy to do it.
Awesome.
Got some answers coming in. We'll give you all another minute or so to get some more information and see what more we can share to best help.
We're always curious what people are most concerned with their Kubernetes environment. It's usually things like security or reliability. But we'd love to hear what you all are concerned with. Looks like security is a big concern. Also getting help with the basics. And yes, I don't think Rachel had time to make a sacrifice to the demo gods. So everyone,
Hope for the best.
stick
All
with
right.
us.
Let's see. I'll go ahead and share my screen. And how's that? Can you see that, Grace?
It's loading. There it is. I see insights.
Perfect. All right. So Insights is a platform that we use to manage a lot of clusters at scale. One thing people will quickly grapple with is how many clusters do I need? In which situation do I use different ones? And here in this platform, which we're going to dive into, you can see we've got, maybe a dozen clusters or so, and it's going to show us a lot of different stuff. Like here we can see a health score by how the cluster is doing, how many action items there are, which we'll jump into in just a second, and seeing trends over time. It's also going to break things down by, what type of action items there are. So to jump into it, what is this platform and where is all this information coming from? So I'm going to go ahead and skip through and go to this Install Hub section real quick. Much of what is in this platform are open source tools that you can download, you can play around with it yourself, you can put it in your cluster and see how it works. And the platform really provides a ton of value in doing this at scale. And so the first thing we're going to look at right here, one of the plugins is Polaris. So for people that are still trying to get the basics and figure out how things are working, Polaris is a great open source tool for figuring out how things are configured, what the best practices are, and what I need to do to fix those. We'll take a look at some more examples in a second. Trivia is another great open source tool. This one is used for scanning containers for vulnerabilities. So when we talked about those 5 issues that come up, we mentioned shifting, container scanning into our CI process, shifting that left. Trivia is a great tool for doing that. You can also run it live in your clusters. So it's going to check for vulnerabilities that are deployed in your infrastructure live and surface those as they come up. We have the open policy agent that allows us to define policy as code. And that works really well with the admission controller. So the admission controller is a tool that before you apply anything in your cluster, it's going to give you a yes or a no on whether or not a resource should be allowed into the cluster. And so with the open policy agent, you could say something like, I don't want to deploy anything into my cluster unless it comes from my internal repo, like the company's repo. So that means no images from Docker Hub are allowed in the cluster because there's a lot of vulnerabilities in Docker Hub and we can't control that. So that's a good way to set up guardrails. We also have tools like Pluto and Nova, again, open source. These are both going to help you with upgrades. So Pluto is going to help you find deprecated APIs in your cluster. If any of you have upgraded to or are in the process of upgrading to version 1.22 in Kubernetes, you'll know there's a lot of deprecated APIs you have to work through. Pluto is going to help you figure out which ones those are so you can start to work on them. Nova is going to find Helm charts that are out of date. So you can see if one of our engineers deployed that thing 2 years ago, it hasn't been updated since then, Nova is going to surface information like that. So we can fix that, get it up to speed, and make sure there aren't any vulnerabilities, working with Trivia, stuff like that. QBench, another great open source tool. This is going to check the cluster against CIS benchmark. So there's a lot of security checks here for those of you that are interested in security. We also have KubeHunter, another great security tool. This is kind of like, the way I think about it is like a penetration testing tool that you can put in your cluster. And it's going to look for known vulnerabilities or areas where we can tighten things up to make sure that attackers can't make the most when they get access into a cluster. RBAC Reporter, another open source tool, is going to look at how all of our RBAC roles are set up in the cluster, how all of that, the cluster role bindings, the roles, how everything is, give us a view into that. And then Prometheus is going to give us some time series data of all of the workloads in our cluster. And this is going to allow us to monitor workloads that we have running to see how to right size those. So maybe we'll find out that we've deployed something to the cluster, it's asking for way too much CPU or memory, and Prometheus is going to show us that data, and then Insights is going to build on that and show us how we can scale that down, because we'll get the same performance but end up saving maybe 75% from whatever we set it to. And then a couple others. We talked about the admission controller briefly. Workloads works with Prometheus to get that data for costs. And Goldilocks is one other great open source tool that is going to suggest CPU and memory settings for each of your workloads. So if you've ever deployed something to the cluster, or if you're just doing this for the first time and you're wondering, how much CPU or memory does this need? This is where a tool like Goldilocks comes into play, and it's going to tell you, you should have this much CPU for your request or this much memory. And Prometheus is going to do the same in Insights, but it's going to be a little bit more accurate since it has that time series data to build off of. So from here, as you can see in this US West staging cluster, we've got a lot of these plugins installed. Again, most of them are open source, so please do go check them out. There's a lot of great stuff out there. The problem becomes, how do I do this at scale? Now I have to keep track of all these different tools. They have different upgrade cycles, and I've got to worry about keeping them upgraded. How do I centralize that data? Maybe some of them are just putting in logs in the container, so I have to go into the cluster and see what it's saying. And that's one of the things where Insights is so powerful, is that it centralizes all this information into one place across all these different clusters. And so if you look at action items, for example, this is the data that all of these plugins are surfacing. And so it's going to share this data by how severe it is. Like here you can see we've got 315 critical action items that have come up. We've got a number of high action items. Most of them are medium. And you can filter down by that pretty quickly to see what they are. And so from here, if we're just looking at our medium action items, we can see there's over 2,000. We can see what the top namespaces are. Maybe there's different things that we need to focus in on, what the top workloads are, and also what the top items are. So in this case, we have 192 different workloads that only have one replica scheduled. So if we care about reliability and there's only one replica running, then if the node that replica gets scheduled to goes down, suddenly that workload goes down with it. In this case, it's Cert Manager. So if this node goes down, Cert Manager goes with it. Cert Manager will get redeployed to a new node, but if somebody relies on that during that interim period, they're not going to be able to get access to it. A better example might be a front end. If you only had one pod for your front end and that node went down, then you're going to have issues because suddenly it's going to start dropping traffic. No one can access it until that front end gets rescheduled to a different node and things come back online. So this is something where it's going to quickly show us, do we think this is something that needs to be reliable? And if so, this is something that we should really focus on remediating. I know a number of you said that security and, figuring out how to get started or best practices are things that were important to you. So we can also filter down by security, for example, and that's going to show us what are the top issues. Here we've got 209 different images that all have vulnerabilities. Here's 101 issues where a container does have insecure capabilities, but it should not. 100 of them have privilege escalation being allowed. And here's 72 instances of the file system being read-only. So a lot of those are like that first item we talked about giving access to the host node underneath it. And so in 72 of these pods, they can write to the underlying host system, and you might not want to set it up that way. 34 of them you're allowed to run as root. That can be problematic for reasons that we talked through as well. And so this is going to take all those different security action items from all those different plugins and surface them in one location. Here you can see some are from Kubebench. A lot of them are going to be from Trivy since there are a lot of image vulnerabilities. And you can kind of slice and dice it from here to see all the different ways to look at that data. So for those of you that are interested in getting started with Kubernetes or figuring out the best practices, Polaris, as we mentioned earlier, is a great tool for figuring that out. And the reason I like Polaris so much is because it's going to show us all of these configuration best practices. One that we just spoke about is how, we should have more than one replicas on our deployments if we want this resource to be reliable. Another one might be image pulse policy should be set to always. Memory limits should be set on our workloads. CPU requests should be set on our workloads. And if you look at a lot of these, they're going to tell you why. Like if we drill down into privilege escalation should not be allowed, it's going to give us a quick description of, why should we, tighten that down and make sure that privilege escalation should not be allowed. It's going to link to docs to give us more information. And there's also this nice YAML output that's going to show us how do we actually fix that. In this case, it's in a pod, but you could use this for deployment or anything else. And you just want to add the security context, allow privilege escalation to false. And that's going to make sure that when Kubernetes schedules this pod and that container spins up, it is not allowed to have privilege escalation. And so it shows us how to remediate these other things and what the best practices are. And yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in here, like should not be allowed to run as root, with reasons for why that is, along with more information. And so yeah, a lot of good stuff in here. Trying to see if there's anything else I might have missed. Polaris, again, really good for learning best practices, figuring out what's misconfigured. You can shift that into your CI pipeline as well with insights. And then with security, there's a lot of great tools like KubeBench, KubeHunter, Trivi's really good. RBAC as well. RBAC lookup's great for that as well.
Polaris has been a great tool for me too. And like you said, Pluto is awesome for kind of figuring out certain issues with the recent CVEs. So we do have one question that came in, if we want to pause on the demo for a moment. And that was, when using Cert Manager, are we still going through Terraform, or is there a direct interaction with Fairwinds? And if so, can we do code signing for moving out updates? I guess if we are going through Terraform.
Yeah, great question. So in this situation, Fairwinds Insights is not going to do anything like manage Cert Manager or deploy it for you. It will just give you visibility into it. And so one example might be, if you're using Terraform, you would still use Terraform. And if you look at something like add-ons, it might show us here that like, here's Cert Manager. It's going to show us in this case that in this cluster, US West staging, Cert Manager is out of date. We're running version 1.0.1, but the newest is 1.2.0. So that's something that we might want to update. And that you can do with Terraform. You can do it with Reckoner. Reckoner is a great tool for managing Helm charts if you want to use Helm for it. And so you can still manage those deployments however you do that or however your company works with that. But this is going to give us that visibility into all of these different issues.
Thanks so much for that question. Yeah, and thanks for your response, Rachel. And anything else we can answer, please let us know.
Absolutely. Yeah, happy to stop and answer any questions. So please do jump in with that. So I'll spend a little time on costs, since that's a big piece of this as well. There's this efficiency page, which is going to work with Prometheus. We can see it here. And it's going to show us in this particular cluster, US West staging. Looks like it's a pretty small cluster. It might even just be a node or two. And it's going to show us that there are 4 CPU cores. I think this is just a sample cluster. It's going to show us how much we are actually using. So in this case, we're only using 1.77 of those CPUs, so less than 50% of what we're paying for. And we've requested up to 3 CPUs. So with our CPU requests, that's going to cause our resources to scale out horizontally. And so this could show us that we might be requesting more CPUs than we actually need if we want to save a bit of money. It's also going to show us the limits for what our limits are on resources. Here we have a limit of 12.91 CPU cores. There's some more good information here. It's going to show us the cost. In this case, again, it's a little sample cluster, so it's really, just about nothing. And it's going to show us the utilization over time. So for CPU, we can see on the 30th of July, I was actually spiking up to 97.82%. So maybe this is actually a good balance of where we want things. We can also look by memory and see here, it looks like the highest memory got was 62.71%. So right away, this tells me that of this node on this cluster, really CPU is the constraint here, since CPU is getting pegged and memory is only at like 62%. So it gives us some high level data pretty quickly about how the cluster is doing. And yeah, it's going to show us more information. If this were in the cloud, it's going to show us an instant type. Like maybe it's like an M5.2x large if you're in AWS. and a lot of other good information like that. And so if that's the high level view, we can also drill down into, I believe if we pick a specific cluster, it's going to give us a view at the workload level. And it's going to show us, of these different things. Again, there's not much on this cluster really. So Prometheus is actually using most of the cost here. If we did have a lot of things deployed to it, we would start to see other things like whatever our different services might be. We would see how they impact cost on the cluster as well. And then from here, you can actually see how much each individual workload is costing us. So in this case, if we have OPA being used, it's going to show us, on average, we have 5.67 pods in this cluster. And it's going to show us what the recommended amount of CPU and memory is that we should set for both requests and limits, along with how much it could save us with those recommendations. You can filter by, what are the largest costs? Not very much, since there's no load on this cluster at all. It's just a little sample cluster, and it's going to show us that in this case, there's pretty minor tweaks that can be had. In some cases, like we've got a client that we worked with where we quickly looked at this screen, and it turned out that they were essentially passing around different Kubernetes YAML manifests from one developer team to the other. And it turned out that they were requesting something like, a lot of CPU and memory that they really didn't need. And the cost difference with recommendations was huge, to the point where they were actually saving tens of thousands of dollars a month by just tweaking these different resource requests and limits. And that was a really powerful way where insights with Prometheus and Goldilocks were able to really help, save them, in that case, a ton of money.
That was a really awesome moment. And I love kind of looking at this page and seeing these small changes that can be made to really, really improve how much money you're spending. We did get another question. I think the question is, does Insights integrate with JFrog Artifactory?
It's a great question. I'm not too familiar with JFrog. I do know that for a lot of the things like doing container image scanning, if my understanding, I think, is that JFrog houses artifacts. And so if there are images there, you can pass credentials to be able to scan those images if they do live there. I'm not sure if JFrog has repos or not. Can't quite recall. Yeah, I'd have to get back to you for more information on some of those details and, what you would want to use it with, or what you would want to get insights into that's in JFrog.
We'd love more information about that. If you want to put it in the chat, or you can always reach out to us via email and we can do a little research and have some better information for you on that. Thank you for the question.
So thinking of security now, if we want to move over to that. So this vulnerabilities section is going to surface, in this case, it's in all clusters. So again, we have Trivy and, a dozen clusters here. Trivy is going to scan all of the container images in all dozen clusters over time. And from here, it's going to surface what vulnerabilities there are. It's going to break it down by the severity. So what is the severity of the CVE and how many there are? It's also going to show us the top impacted images. In this case, it looks like there's a lot for metric server. There's over 6,000 vulnerabilities in the metric server image. I imagine every cluster is probably using this metric server image, and there's just a tremendous amount of vulnerabilities in there, it looks like. There's this node Debian image. We also have Grafana has a lot of vulnerabilities, Jenkins. It's a great way to just very quickly see which of our images deployed to our clusters have the most vulnerabilities, and start thinking about how do we want to prioritize remediating these vulnerabilities. From here, it's also going to show us the top packages that are within those images. It looks like this libc dev package has the most vulnerabilities. And then from here, it's going to break things down by, how many vulnerabilities for these different images, which clusters they're in. We can take a better look at these and see that information. It looks like AlphaProd, GovCloud, some other ones. If we've shifted this left into our CI pipeline, it's going to show us repositories. Like right here, this Nginx 1.18 Alpine image it is in one of our repositories and has 31 vulnerabilities. So in this case, we might not have even deployed this into our cluster yet, but we already know that this 1.18 image has all these vulnerabilities. So if I'm an engineer and I'm trying to get things into a good state in my cluster, maybe I have committed things into whatever Git repo I'm using, got it connected to Insights. It's going to scan that image before I even deploy it and let me know that there's a lot of vulnerabilities. And so before I even get later on down the road and worry about upgrading this, I already know before I get started that maybe I should look and see if there's a newer version that doesn't have as many vulnerabilities. And so that can help save a lot of time here as well. If there are fixed versions, it's going to show us like a recommended tag. So here we've got 2.346.2. And here's a different version which might fix a lot of those vulnerabilities. And so if shifting to a different version, it'll actually show you how much risk you can reduce by shifting to a newer version or whichever version has that fix, along with the different CVEs that are in that image and what they might be, the different titles, the different CVEs, what versions installed. So it just really helps us get a good look into all of the vulnerabilities and what specifically they are in all of the different clusters.
Thanks for walking us through that, Rachel. I feel like the vulnerabilities information is extremely important as well, and there's a lot of great data here. We did get a little bit of a clarification on JFrog Artifactory. It's a repository of artifacts as well as a container repo and a software repository. And I have a question in with the team to find out if Insights does indeed integrate. So I will let you know shortly.
So with the container repo in JFrog Artifactory, that's something where if you integrate Fairwinds into your CI pipeline, as long as you can pass, like let's say your container repo is private, as long as you can pass the credentials so that the environment in your CI environment has access to that container repo, then Trivy will be able to scan those images in that repo, and that way you can scan your own private images and figure out what vulnerabilities there are. So it's not so much an integration into Insights as it is an integration into, in that situation, your CI environment. Can your CI environment access the JFrog container repo? And if so, then Trivy can certainly scan for things there. So what else? So we can look at the repositories page briefly. This is, again, if we shift things left into our CI environment, this is going to show us different repositories that we have. Maybe these are set up in GitHub or they're set up in GitLab or wherever they might be. And it's going to scan different Helm charts or YAML files as they come in. It's going to look for any misconfigurations that are there. It's also going to scan images with Trivy. And then if we have any guardrails set up with the Open Policy Agent, it's going to check against those as well. So when you're thinking about best practices, this is another situation where before we ever deploy anything into the cluster, we can figure out what misconfigurations we might have. And in this case, there are 4 resources where the file system should be read-only. And so we can quickly correct those. And then that way, when we do deploy into production, we'll be in a lot better situation because we won't even expose that that potential, attack vector or escalation point, since we've already remediated it before anything got into the cluster. We can also see CPU requests are not set on 3 resources. That can certainly impact reliability. And so that's something that we're going to want to set as well. And yeah, it's going to show us a lot of the same information. Like here in this repo, there's this geode repo, and it's going to show us a lot of what we saw earlier. Like here, if we add security context, allow privilege escalation to false, then that is going to fix that before it even gets into production. And moving on from here, a couple of last things. If we're thinking about things like policy and guardrails, we do have a policy page. And here we can take any of these checks that we see and we can actually enforce on them. So let's say we have something like, CPU requests should be set. Maybe we have set up a production cluster, all the engineers that are working on it, they are up to speed, they know best practices, they know that they should set CPU requests on all the different workloads. Maybe 6 months goes by and we start hiring new engineers who might not know these best practices. How do we know they are going to set up these CPU requests and limits and things? And this is where the policy page comes in handy, because we can actually set it to be blocking, so that if a workload tries to come into Kubernetes without a CPU request set, we can actually deny it entry. So we as an organization could say CPU requests need to be set, because if they are not, those workloads are not going to be as reliable. Things might not scale out as effectively, and it can cause some real issues in our cluster if we're not careful and we do this over and over again. So that's a great situation where you can use policies to actually enforce good behavior and what we're looking for. There's a lot of other stuff to look through. So any of these things you might want to add policy around is something we can certainly do as well. And then if you want to do custom policies, you can actually use OPA to do this. And we've got a number of different templates. Like if a DNS hostname is too long, I know it's actually not going to issue a certification. Like if you use Cert Manager and you use it with Let's Encrypt, for example, Cert Manager is going to generate a cert for our workloads. It's going to reach out to Let's Encrypt and say, hey, I need a cert. And if your host name is longer than 63 characters, Let's Encrypt is not going to issue you a cert, because that's longer than one of the RFCs that say, host name should be under 63 characters. And so that's an example of an OPA policy that we could set in place that is going to stop something from being deployed to the cluster that we know will not have a cert generated for it. And it's a great way to just get ahead of any issues that might come up. And there's a lot of great examples in here. A lot of them have come from, working with all different kinds of clients. And so that's where a lot of these best practices are kind of built into this platform. And it allows us to really help do a lot of these things at scale. And so with that, I think that's what we've got for now. If anyone has any other questions, please do drop them in the chat. We would love to talk about them.
Thanks for doing that live demo for us, Rachel. And it looks like the demo gods smiled upon you today. I'm thankful for that. And yes, if anyone has any additional questions, we'd love to hear them. I think we also have a best practices white paper to send out potentially.
So yeah, this white paper is going to go over a lot of the stuff that we talked about today. It's going to talk about, Kubernetes best practices around security, cost optimization, reliability, policy enforcement, and monitoring and alert. And so feel free to grab that. I think, we might share it. I think there might be an email that goes out. I'm not entirely sure. And if you have any questions about anything, please do reach out to us at Fairwinds. We work with all different people at all different stages of using Kubernetes, getting into it, whether you've been into it for years and you just need some help around things, or you're trying to take things to the next level to help enforce more best practices.
Yeah, and we'd love to give you a personalized demo too, which I believe you can sign up for on our website, and we'd be happy to talk more about it with you there.
All right, so while we give our audience just another minute or so to send any last second questions, I will go ahead and take this opportunity to give away a couple of gift cards. So we do have 4 $25 Amazon gift cards to give out. Our first winner is Nick N. Our second winner is James S. Our third winner is Anthony O. And our fourth and final winner is Somaready R. So to the 4 of you, congratulations. Please keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. But if you don't happen to see that email, just check your spam folder. And I would also like to take this opportunity to remind our audience that today's session was in fact recorded. So following this panel, you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording on demand. You can also find the recording living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars, and just be sure to look in the on-demand section.
Cody, I didn't hear a Rachel or Grace in that list. Could you check it again if you don't mind?
I think we need to recheck that list.
I might have to redo the whole drawing. Awesome. So I'm not seeing any more questions at the moment. So before we close out, Grace, Rachel, any final thoughts?
I just thank you all so much for joining us today, and I'm excited to hopefully connect with you all.
Yeah, I'm echoing what Grace says. Thank you all so much for your time. And if you have any questions, please reach out and we would love to chat.
All
Are
right,
we
well,
able
thank
to
you.
post the white paper in chat, or will you be sending that out?
We can make sure that's sent out afterwards.
Perfect. Wonderful.
Absolutely. All right. So we would like to thank Fairwinds for sponsoring today's webinar. Grace, Rachel, thank you both so much for joining us today. And to our audience, thank you so much for spending time with us. We do ask for one extra moment of your time for a brief survey that will pop up on your screen here in just a moment. But otherwise, we do hope to see you all at an upcoming Techstrong learning program. Everyone, have a great rest of your day.